PRX.
At one point last summer, America's favorite beer changed.
Big news in the big business of beer tonight. America's top-selling beer is no longer American.
This morning, America has a new favorite beer, and it's a Mexican import.
Okay, Jack, the old king of beers has been dethroned. Who is the new king?
Shocker coming up. Modelo Especial is the new top-selling beer in America. Modelo Especial. Like, everybody kind of figured,
The crisp Bud Light was replaced by the fuller-bodied and imported Modelo as the top-selling brew in the country. This was owed in part to a customer boycott of Bud Light for its campaign with trans social media personality Dylan Mulvaney.
This month, I celebrated my day 365 of womanhood, and Bud Light sent me possibly the best gift ever, a can with my face on it. Check out my Instagram story to see.
The whole episode was followed by a counter backlash when the beer company backtracked on its collaboration with the star. But for those who'd been following the U.S. beer market closely, it was really only a matter of time before Modelo Especial was going to take over Bud Light's top spot.
So if the fiasco had not happened, Modelo would have overtaken Bud Light eventually, next year, the year after.
Ina Verstol is one of those people closely following the industry. She's a journalist in Munich covering the business of beer.
But the boycott, the huge consumer boycott, just sped things up incredibly. And so it happened in the summer. I think it was May or June. In monthly sales, it overtook. And the decline of Bud Light has continued now into the autumn and into the winter. Modelo is just keeping up its trajectory. So the gap will widen unless AB InBev manages to persuade its former consumers to return to the brand.
This is The Closer. I'm Amy Keene. That Modelo knocked Bud Light from its perch is about much more than a marketing U-turn. It's a story about how the Department of Justice, and one lawyer in particular, along with a then little-known wine and spirits company from upstate New York, threw a wrench in a massive beer deal. We'll be right back with that story. Ina Verstol has spent much of her career studying and writing about beer, both the drink itself and the economics of the business.
And my name already gives it away. I'm a German national, but I grew up in England.
Why do you think we should understand the business of beer?
The business of beer is very closely related to market conditions, whether you operate in a monopoly, a duopoly, or if you have an oligopoly. Depending on the degree of concentration, there's a different level of competition. And the more concentrated a market becomes, the less competition there is. And if one of the big players raises prices and the competitor, or the big competitor, also follows suit, then prices just go up and consumers can't do anything but pay for beer through their noses. And I put this very politely now because I don't object to companies making a profit. Let this be understood. But still, I mean, there is a degree of profitability that is not beneficial to consumers.
For many years in the U.S., there was one beer company whose brands had a hold on the market, Anheuser-Busch.
And they were very, very clever and skillful operators because they had managed to hike their market share in the US to close to 50% by volume without doing any deals. So over the decades, the Department of Justice was wary of the old Anheuser-Busch's market position. But since they didn't do any deals, they couldn't stop them from growing.
And then, in 2008, it was taken over by a company called InBev, a company that was itself the result of a series of other deals. The newly formed company went by AB InBev.
Department of Justice kept a close eye on what they were doing. So when they were taken over, they controlled close to 50% of the beer market already. And there was only one competitor at the time called Miller Coors. And the two had close to 80% of the market.
AB InBev's most popular label, Bud Light.
For the great taste that won't fill you up and never let you down, make it a Bud Light.
Originally, that's going back decades into the last century, the main seller was Budweiser beer.
Bud.
But that had fallen out of favor with Americans when the big brewers launched these, what they call light beers in the US. These beers that have fewer calories than regular beers like Budweiser. And the marketing they also installed played to the idea of this is an all-American beer.
Conveniently, AB InBev held a stake in the maker of popular imported beers. It's called Grupo Modelo from Mexico. This was the company behind Corona, Modelo Especial, and other brands.
The trouble was that the old Anheuser-Busch had been had over a barrel by Grupo Modelo in the 1990s.
Grupo Modelo had been worried that with the creation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, Anheuser-Busch would be able to flood the Mexican market with brands like Budweiser and Bud Light. So instead, they decide,
we sell a stake to the old Anheuser-Busch, which then would actually become something like a non-aggression pact.
Crucially, though, for Grupo Modelo, this stake did not include any management control.
They were not necessarily in the business for the love of beer. They were businessmen above all.
And by 2012, Anheuser-Busch was now AB InBev, and it was looking to change this arrangement.
AB InBev saw that this is no good. This is a very untenable situation for us. For one, we still have no management say because this is the contract they inherited from the old Anheuser-Busch. And we can't lay our hands on the import or export business of Corona in the US. So they said, okay, we're going to take over Grupo Modelo. Then we have control of Mexico, which was then also a very profitable and growing beer market. So Modelo in Mexico itself was attractive. But they also hoped that ultimately they would be able to lay their hands on the import business.
The two sides came to an agreement. AB InBev would buy out the other half of Grupo Modelo. The price? $20 billion.
In corporate news, AB InBev is reportedly in talks to buy the rest of Grupo Modelo it doesn't already own, in a deal that could be worth...
Here, the market likes the deal, bidding Anheuser-Busch shares up almost 8% at all-time high. The deal expands what is already the world's largest beer maker. Beverage distributor...
But there was another crucial element to this deal. Buying up all of Grupo Modelo was probably going to raise the antitrust alarm at the Department of Justice. So AB InBev and Grupo Modelo concocted a side deal. To sell its products in the U.S., Grupo Modelo had formed a joint venture called Crown Imports, and they did so with a wine distributor called Constellation Brands.
Modelo would sell its 50% stake in the U.S. import business, which was called Crown Imports, to Constellation for less than $2 billion.
The proposed side deal gave Constellation Brands control of the Grupo Modelo beers in the U.S., but with a catch.
But all they were given was a 10-year supply contract. And not only would that have meant that if AB InBev, as the new owner of Modelo, had raised supply prices, then Constellation would have had to raise prices in the US too.
That side deal that AB InBev and Grupo Modelo had drawn up included one more important point.
That AB InBev would be able to buy out Constellation at the end of this 10-year term.
You've mentioned a few times now Constellation Brands, and I'd love to just take a minute to actually explain to listeners what this company was and how it fit into the picture. Can you just tell us about what the company was, what it was known for, what it was like at the time in 2012?
Well, Constellation has a very interesting history. It started out as a bulk wine company in the 1940s already. It was not terribly profitable, especially when branded wines and domain wines and high-end brands were kind of emerging in the 70s and 80s. And the opportunity that arose for them to really diversify away from wine was in 1993, when they could buy Barton Beers from Chicago, an importer, which was at the time one of the two importers of Corona in the US. So in 2012, Constellation was really at the mercy of Modelo and Anheuser-Busch, because they did the primary deal, and what would become of them was of secondary concern.
So just to make sure we see, it almost feels a bit like a love triangle here of three drinks companies. AB InBev in 2012 already has a stake in Grupo Modelo, Mexico's Grupo Modelo. They decide now is the time, we have to take over entirely. But in order to, or as part of this deal, they arrange a side deal with Constellation Brands, who has the ability to sell Grupo Modelo within the U.S. As part of this deal, AB InBev says to Constellation Brands, you will continue selling for 10 years, and then we will get the rights to that part of the business. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And at the time when the original deal was published, I thought, how could Constellation really agree to such unfavorable terms? I mean, call me suspicious-minded. My suspicion was at the time that Constellation hoped, or if they were reckless, trusted the Department of Justice to step in and tear up the proposed agreement altogether.
And in early 2013, that's just what the Justice Department did, which took AB InBev by surprise.
Apparently, AB InBev had been persuaded by its own legal team, these hired legal guns, as you like to put it in America, that the deal that they had initially submitted would be green lighted by the Department of Justice. And I thought, they must be mad. How could they believe in their wildest dreams that this deal would go through?
There was one Department of Justice official leading the charge in these beer wars. It was a lawyer by the name of Bill Baer.
And I spoke to Mr. Baer a few weeks ago, and I said to him, hello, since the 1990s, I have been looking at academic literature on the American beer industry. And academics for 30 years, since the 1990s, have been saying concentration is too high. That means competition is too low. And when they say competition is too low, it's to the detriment of consumers. And of course, the Department of Justice people, they would have been looking at the proposed transaction, would have said, no, this is not going to fly. And they were fortunate that Mr. Baer had just taken over the antitrust division at the Department of Justice in 2013. He said, this deal is a non-starter, guys.
Baer is himself an interesting character in this story. For one, the financial press has noted his own apparent love for beer, and American beer at that. But Ina, who recently spoke to him about this deal, says he was much more focused on competition in his beloved U.S. beer market than anything.
He seems very sociable and very approachable, and he's not talking legalese. So he does not mince words. And so he's very straight talking, very charming. I asked him, can you explain to me what that meeting was like? And he said, the first meeting when they all met, and he said to me, yeah, it was just funny. It was a room full of lawyers, probably 40 lawyers all together, and they were all talking legalese. So no drama, no shouting, none of the telenovela stuff. But it was still dramatic because AB InBev legal team told him the deal is good and it's sound. It's not to the detriment of consumers. And we have made sure of this and that and that. And Mr. Baer just retorted and said, this deal is a non-starter. And that took them aback.
What Baer wanted for the U.S. beer market was an independent third player, a third company.
And with the Modelos out of the picture, there would have been no third player, because if the original deal had gone through, Constellation would have been reduced to an importer again, and this time as the importer of another rough-playing global heavyweight called AB InBev. So, and he said this is not good to consumers, and the legal team was taken aback, and they said, can you please adjourn it for a week? And so they met again 1 week later, and AB InBev had brought along its CEO, Carlos Brito, and Carlos Brito basically gave the same spiel his lawyers had given the previous week. And Mr. Bear said, as he told me, okay, you haven't changed your tune. This is not good enough. And then they challenged him and said, well, if you don't want to greenlight this deal, sue us then. And he said, I will, trust me.
Meantime, a big beer battle is brewing.
A battle over beer is brewing.
We'll begin with the beer battle brewing. The Justice Department today suing to block the $20 billion merger between Anheuser-Busch InBev and Mexican brewer Modelo. Using company documents to bolster their case, Justice Department lawyers say the deal will lead to higher prices for popular beers like Budweiser and Corona.
Bayer published the DOJ's position in a nearly 300-page publicly available document.
It gave you very precise market data. The complaint quotes from internal communications amongst all the big players in the industry. So I had never seen anything so precise and comprehensive before in my life.
Here's Bill Baer in a recent interview with the Wall Street Journal about the deal.
We said you need InBev to completely divest any interest in Modelo as it relates to the United States. They thought I was crazy.
Is there a line or a section that you still remember to this day that really jumped out at you as you were reviewing the suit published to the web?
What I found interesting in that suit was that they kind of admitted, the other players quoted in that complaint, that they always followed each other's price hikes. Not regularly, not always, but often. I think the term that appears in the complaint is often. And I thought, yeah, this is what I had noticed too as a consumer. They were very clued up about what went on in the US beer market.
The lawsuit alleged that the big domestic US brands had been following each other's price increases for years.
That means that if one raises prices, the others will also raise prices.
Meanwhile, the imported Modelo brands kept their prices steady. This meant that over time, there wasn't much of a price difference between the domestic American beers and the imported Modelo beers.
So basically, people will not have to look for cheaper options because they are all at about the same level. So no competition, no one is expanding market shares because they don't take share away from each other.
And by making the evidence in his lawsuit public, Baer was trying to show how the lack of competition in the beer business actually affected customers.
And I asked Mr. Baer, why did you put this out into the public domain? Why did you put all this, I would consider confidential data into this complaint? He said, well, I wanted to make AB InBev relent. That was his word, relent. And I thought, okay, in my terminology, that would have been, you were out to name and shame them. And it had the desired effect because the Department of Justice already had a plan of a settlement.
A settlement that would change the U.S. beer market and create a path for an imported label to become America's favorite. We'll be right back. In early 2013, the U.S. Department of Justice had set the stage for a showdown in the U.S. beer market. In a long and detailed filing, DOJ lawyer Bill Baer laid out his assessment of what would happen to U.S. beer customers if AB InBev were to fully take over Mexico's Grupo Modelo.
They knew what they wanted the ultimate deal to look like because they wanted Constellation to become independent, economically viable, and not at the mercy of AB InBev. But that meant that Constellation needed a brewery in Mexico to be really independent from any supply contract with AB InBev.
Constellation being Constellation Brands, that company that was supposed to have the U.S. import rights for Grupo Modelo products for a mere 10 years as part of AB InBev's takeover plans.
So the department said Constellation must get Modelo's Swishest brewery in Mexico. And Constellation must be given time to expand this brewery. But by actually setting them up or setting Constellation up as an independent brewer, Mr. Bear managed to actually expand the US beer duopoly into a oligopoly with 3 powerful players.
So the DOJ first steps in, I think it's January of 2013. And just a few months later, by April, news breaks, I think late one Friday, that AB InBev have reached an agreement with the Department of Justice to let their deal through.
Anheuser-Busch InBev is closer to putting its $20 billion acquisition of Grupo Modelo in the can. AB InBev worked out a deal with the government.
The settlement looked like this. The U.S. government would let AB InBev's takeover of Grupo Modelo go through, provided the companies left Modelo's U.S. business to Constellation Brands. This included the licenses of Grupo Modelo's beer brands and that brewery in Mexico.
So the one who had to actually do the most agreeing was AB InBev, because they saw their original proposal shredded, torn to pieces. They had to give that brewery in Mexico to Constellation. Constellation was allowed to buy out the whole import business in perpetuity. And they would also obtain the rights to the brands in perpetuity. So that was far more than the original proposal would have awarded to Constellation.
And I think what's important to note here, too, is the price tag. So Constellation Brands picks up Grupo Modelo as part of the settlement for less than $5 billion. That seems an awfully small price for Constellation to pay.
Yeah, and they were lucky because they were the only buyer around. And if you are the only buyer around, the profit multiple that usually applies is far lower than if there had been a string of buyers wanting to buy that business. So they got a very good deal.
A very good deal, which instantly made them the 3rd largest beer supplier in the country. So once the deal's finalized, what happens with Constellation now being such a big U.S. beer supplier? How does the picture shift with the conclusion of the settlement?
What Constellation chose to do was to continue with its aggressive pricing. And that meant that both of their leading brands, I mean, the super leader was Corona Extra at the time, but Modelo Especial was already catching up nicely. So by keeping those prices not low, but the proper term is by closing the price gap between those import brands and Bud Light, people traded up to Modelo because they said, okay, I want something nicer, something special, and it's only a little bit more expensive than Bud Light. So that pricing strategy alone worked in Constellation's favor. But they also did very clever things with the brands.
Those clever things include marketing, like launching Modelo Especial advertising in English for the first time.
In 1925, we created a model beer, a full-flavored Mexican lager, appropriately named Modelo Especial.
While Corona continued to be an American favorite, Modelo Especial caught on with American customers.
Modelo is another interesting packaging because the bottle looks really squat. It's still wrapped in this gold foil, something we in the rest of the world would have gotten rid of already because it's environmentally so unsound. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, of course.
This is the perspective I give you. But I mean, they stuck to it. I mean, this is how it was marketed. And of course, the gold foil is to represent, this is something better. This is something high-end. This is really brilliant quality because we don't stint on the packaging even. So the beers are now I try to be polite, inoffensive. I mean, they are excellent at what they aim to be. They are not really beers that are in your face. So they are very agreeable, easy to drink beers that look different and are called something different. So that made them easy to stick out, both of these brands. And I think we have to actually acknowledge the role Corona has played here too.
A Corona and palm trees.
A Corona and calm seas.
Because Corona led the way or barged ahead and Modelo could follow. When the settlement was signed in 2013, the Modelo brand was not available in all US states. Because, I mean, this is what the Mexicans had done together with Constellation. They very cautiously pushed this brand state by state into the country. It became desirable by not being available in all states initially. So that's a very clever strategy. And I think what they also did was they did not choose an American imagery for the brand. I mean, it's still a Mexican brand. I mean, Modelo Especial, I mean, that's as Spanish sounding as it is. They said, okay, we need to find values and an imagery for this brand that appeals to everybody, that all consumers can relate to. And that's the fighting spirit.
You are fighters, and this is your reward. Modelo, the mark of a fighter.
And so by 2023, Modelo was on course to take over Bud Light as the best-selling beer in the U.S. before too long. Then came Bud Light's marketing mishap.
Partnership between Bud Light and transgender activist Dylan Mulvaney getting a lot of backlash.
Bud Light's fall comes after the company picked transgender influencer Dylan Mulvaney to promote Bud Light and created a customized Bud Light can for Mulvaney. Conservatives called for a boycott of Bud Light.
Bud Light sales were down more than 24% compared to a year ago for the week ending June 3rd. Ashley, that's been pretty steady since this controversy first broke, hitting sales, turning investors.
And the Mexican import took over sooner than expected.
So if the fiasco had not happened, Modelo would have overtaken Bud Light eventually, next year, the year after. But the boycott, the huge consumer boycott, just sped things up incredibly.
It's been a little more than 10 years now since the settlement was agreed. You'll recall the original proposed AB InBev deal included getting back the rights to the Modelo brands in the U.S. after 10 years. But instead, thanks to that settlement, the U.S. beer market has been reshaped, and those U.S. rights still belong to Constellation Brands. Is there a deal-making lesson in this story here somewhere?
In the U.S., never underestimate the Department of Justice.
That's a good one.
It could be an expensive mistake to underestimate the Department of Justice.
My last question for you, Ina, is a personal one. Completely outside of the brands we've discussed today, what beer do you like to drink?
Always a local beer, wherever I am, because that's freshest.
Freshest, and I guess it gives you a sense of the local market.
That's me, yeah.
That's our episode for this week, but there's much more from my conversation with Ina for Brazen Plus subscribers on Apple Podcasts. The Closer is a production of Project Brazen in partnership with PRX. Our show is produced by Isabel Kirby-McGowan, Trina Menino, and Anna Muto. Ben Walsh is our reporter, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, and Lucy Woods is head of research. Megan Dean is programming manager, and Ryan Ho is design lead. Golda Arthur is our showrunner, and Bradley Hope and Tom Wright are executive producers. Our marketing consultant is Maggie Taylor, and I'm Amy Keene. Thanks for listening.